How to Eat Like Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin is the most amazing character from the 18th century. He is world famous. He's eccentric. He's a philosopher. And he tells us about how he eats. We have Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, and we get a lot of detail about his thoughts about eating, not just what he's eating, but his thoughts about eating. And it really helps us get a glimpse. Now, he's eccentric. He's not eating like everyone else in the 18th century, but he kind of gives us an idea by contrasting how he's eating, comparing it to what regular people were eating in the 18th century. I was quite indifferent to what kind of food was set before me, and so unobservant of it that to this day, if I am asked, I can scarce tell a few hours after dinner what I dined upon. Early on in his childhood, let's say in his teens, he gets a book printed in the 18th century about vegetarianism. This book has some ideas about being a vegetarian because it was economical, maybe inexpensive, and also some ethical ideas, like is eating meat proper? So Benjamin Franklin becomes a vegetarian in his teens, and he, tries to convince other people of that same idea. It isn't very long, though, that when he's a vegetarian, that he decides, after seeing a fish being served up in a particular situation, that there are fish inside the belly of a fish, that if animals eat other animals, then maybe it's okay for people to eat animals too. So he isn't as strict a vegetarian after that, but he certainly still continues some of those ideas because he is a very frugal person. He grew up in a household where he was trained as a child to not take too much care or attention about how good the food was. It was more important to eat for energy purposes, and not so much to, spend all your time wanting to eat the very best food. That wasn't supposed to be an important thing. It was better for you to have conversation in your mealtime. That was more important than enjoying the food to some great extent. He even talks about how that's very beneficial to him as he travels later on in life, because, if the food wasn't great, it didn't bother him any. He wasn't greatly disappointed as he travels and has to eat the bare minimum of food, or even things he didn't really care for. He was trained to that even as a young person. They wandered to see from this and several instances that the water American, as they called me, was stronger than themselves, who drank strong beer. So we know Benjamin Franklin as an inventor and a mover and shaker in politics and in public works, but he grew up and in his early life, he was just a regular working man. And we get some clues to what he thought about food in that circumstance by his working when he was young in the shop. So other people would go out to lunch. They would, have an extravagant meal for an hour. He would stay in the shop. He would eat simply bread and cheese, and he would spend his time reading, studying, getting better at his job. He thought that reading books was more important than going out to lunch. Benjamin Franklin spends time in London working in a printing shop as a regular, working stiff. And he thought it was very strange that they spent all this time eating lunch and drinking beer all day long. So Benjamin Franklin wasn't a big fan of beer. I don't think that he necessarily thought it was bad, but he didn't want to spend that time, especially that much money, all day long. The workers in the London print shops were spending a great portion of their working wage buying beer to drink all day long. Benjamin Franklin, he was a water drinker. They made fun of him for drinking water, yet he could carry great heavy loads. He didn't, they said strong beer makes a strong person. Benjamin Franklin knew that wasn't true, that water could make a strong person too. Our supper was only a half an anchovy each, on a very little strip of bread and butter, and a half a pint of ale between us. But the entertainment was in her conversation. Benjamin Franklin was also a philosopher, and his philosophy actually included food. So he had a whole great section on the art of virtue, how to be a virtuous person. And what is his first virtue? The one that you need to start on first, and it's eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. So right there, the very first principle in his philosophy was don't eat so much that it distracts you from the things you really ought to be doing. And don't drink too much so that, you lose your way. So that was a core foundation of his very philosophy of life. Interestingly enough, part of eating is not eating. That is fasting. And where he was in Pennsylvania, fasting was not a big part of the way where people were living. But he grew up in New England, and fasting was part of living. People did do fasts on purpose, usually in a religious context. So when he was down in Pennsylvania and there was a particular circumstance where they thought that fasting would be a good idea, Benjamin Franklin said, yes, I know just exactly how to write up and encourage people to fast for a particular purpose. Now, it's fun as we look at Benjamin Franklin as he gets later on in life. And maybe as we know him in his more, famous parts of later life, we see him as a jet setter. He's moving around. He's going to England. He's going to France. And he's a famous, international figure. And we know that from his portraits that, he was enjoying eating at that point. That later on in life, maybe that super plain living isn't as important to him. He knows that he has to rub shoulders with other people and eat fancy meals. His life circumstances change, and his eating has to change at the same time. But she thought her husband deserved a silver spoon and a china bowl, as well as any of his neighbors. We have an English proverb that says, "He that would thrive must ask his wife." And then he's talking about his wife being frugal and hardworking. But then something happens. He says, for instance, my breakfast was a long time bread and milk. And that's boiled bread and milk. It's a panada. We've done an episode on that before. And no tea. And I ate it out of a 2-penny earthen porringer. Think Tupperware. With a pewter spoon. But mark how luxury will enter families and make a progress, in spite of principle. Being called one morning to breakfast, I found it in a china bowl with a silver spoon. They had been bought for me without my knowledge by my wife, and had cost her the enormous sum of 23 shillings, for which she had no other excuse or apology to make but that she thought her husband deserved a silver spoon and a china bowl, as well as any of his neighbors. So there was a point where his wife thought, no, you need to start looking more like a wealthy person on purpose, because this will actually help you out in the public sphere. And it doesn't sound like he complained that much about it. So how do we eat like Benjamin Franklin? I think we can pull some really interesting conclusions out of this. All the way from his earliest childhood, the first time he's talking about food, where he grows up in his father's house, and his father was much more concerned about conversation and learning during a mealtime than he was about fancy food. Almost to the point of almost ignoring the food. As we get later in life, Benjamin Franklin seems to be doing that same thing. It's like, no, I can still be frugal when I'm by myself and isn't important. But as someone who has to work within political circles, yes, I will eat fancy and I will have these conversations. Will I spend all my time worrying about what this food is like? Probably not so much. But having that conversation, having that community and that fellowship was much more important than the food is for Benjamin Franklin. If you'd like to learn more about Benjamin Franklin, his eating, his life, his philosophy, you can find that here in the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. You'll find a copy of that on our website. You'll find a link down in the description section. Also, if you want to go in depth with us on the Townsends Book Club, where we go into the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, you'll find it all here on this playlist.